Good evening, and thank you for joining us today on a beautiful, if very windy, spring day. For anyone who may be attending a virtual MHS program for the first time, welcome. We are an independent nonprofit organization that hosts a wide variety of programs and maintains a research library with millions of pages of correspondence, documents, and printed materials. Thanks to the support of our members, our programs and library are open to the public. We hope you'll return for future events, and we'll explore our collections at this point virtually, but hopefully soon in person. And of course, if you enjoy our programs, we hope you'll consider supporting our work and becoming a member. My name is Gavin Kleespies. I am the Director of Programs, Exhibitions, and Community Partnerships for the Massachusetts Historical Society, and I'm happy to welcome you to a great program this evening. This evening, we are joined by Professor Christopher Capozzola, who will talk about his book, Bound by War: How the United States and the Philippines Built America's First Pacific Century. Professor Capozzola is a longtime friend of MHS. He has been a fellow since 2009 and is an active member of our research committee. When Professor Capozzola is not being a part of MHS events, he is a professor of history at MIT who teaches courses in political and legal history, war in the military, and the history of international migration. He graduated from Harvard College and completed his PhD at Columbia University. And his research interests are in the history of citizenship, war, and the military in modern American history. In his talk today, he will explore how war and military service forged an enduring yet fraught alliance between Americans and Filipinos in the century since U.S. troops occupied the Philippines in 1898. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Professor Capozzola for the program this evening. Great to see you.
All right. Thank you, Gavin, and thank you all for coming on this beautiful spring evening, wherever you are joining from. And special thanks to Gavin and to Sarah for organizing this event. Thank you to the entire MHS community for welcoming me over the past 10 or 15 years, both from programming, from the scholarly programs, as well as from the research library. And also a special thanks to the Massachusetts Historical Society for making space for this program and for really thinking about the history of Asians and Asian Americans at a time when not knowing that history has important consequences of violence and xenophobia. And I think it's very important that everyone who's tuning in sort of reflect on this history and the ways in which we can respond to the challenges that we are dealing with in the country at this moment. What I want to do this evening is talk for about 35 minutes from my new book, Bound by War. I'll be showing a series of images from the book and from some related research projects that I've done. And Sarah Bertulli is going to share at the beginning and then later in the Q&A some links to some digital history projects that I've had the chance to work on over the last few years that have kind of made this history accessible to a wide range of learners, K-12 students, instructors, and others. So if you are multitasking while listening to or watching this talk, feel free to check out those images now or to explore them later at your leisure. So what I'd like to do for the next few minutes is walk you through the story of Bound by War, how the United States and the Philippines built America's first Pacific century, a book that I have recently published with Basic Books. And I want to bring to life some of the stories in the book. It's a long book that covers a full century or more of history. I'm going to give you a broad overview of the book itself, and then a deep dive into one particular part of the story in the years right after the Second World War. But let me begin actually right where the book does, which is here at the Manila American Cemetery, located on 152 acres, just a few miles outside the Philippine capital, which memorializes more than 36,000 soldiers and sailors who fought and died under the American flag in the Pacific during the Second World War. Now, to enter the cemetery is to leave, in many ways, the noise and pace of 21st century Manila. As you can see, there are spacious grounds maintained more carefully than a golf course. The cemetery offers the city's freshest air, its greenest grass. And from this hilltop site near the former site of the US Army's Fort McKinley, the cemetery and its central memorial command remarkable views, both of the skyscrapers and apartment buildings of a booming Asian metropolis, of rolling hills to the east, and hazy sunsets over Manila Bay to the west. And as a memorial to the sacrifices of war, it is, as Abraham Lincoln said at Gettysburg, altogether fitting and proper. It is also, on most days, remarkably empty. The first time I visited, I was one of the only Americans there. And even in Manila, it is easy to overlook this American cemetery. Neighboring Fort McKinley, which you can see here in a historic postcard, is long gone, turned over in 1949 to the Armed Forces of the Philippines. And Fort McKinley has more recently been replaced in part by an upscale shopping center known simply as the Fort. But in the quiet moments that predominate on that Manila hilltop, the names of the Pacific War dead tell a story, a shared history of two nations bound by a century of war. As the cemetery shows, as the stones attest, the US military has been in the Philippines for a long time, starting in 1898, when America conquered the Spanish colony and annexed it to the United States. Then in the years from 1898 to 1946, when the Philippines was an American colony, and in the decades since, when it has been a crucial American ally in Asia. Now, Filipinos have been in the United States Armed Forces for just as long. Beginning in 1898 and continuing to this day, hundreds of thousands of Filipinos and Filipino Americans have served under the American flag. The first were the Philippine Scouts, recruited into Uncle Sam's service during the earliest phases of the Philippine-American War in 1899. By the 1920s, Scouts actually outnumbered US soldiers in the territory and were a crucial component of the US forces in the Pacific. In the years between the two world wars, Filipinos also joined the US Navy, nearly all of them restricted to bottom rung positions as cooks or stewards. The Second World War is the heart of the book and a crucial turning point in this history, when some 7,000 Filipino migrants in the United States joined the US Army's 1st and 2nd Filipino regiments at a time when the Army was still largely segregated. More than 120,000 served in the ranks of the doomed Philippine Army that met the invading Japanese forces in 1942, and at least 70,000, and probably more, men and women fought in the guerrilla movements that battled Japanese occupation and supported American reinvasion in 1944. Some 67,000 of the 76,000 prisoners on the Bataan Death March were Filipinos who served under the American flag, and yet most of those men waited until 2009 to receive equitable veterans benefits and citizenship rights from the United States government. My question, simply put, is what took so long? And what do we learn in answering that question about the shared history of the United States and the Philippines, both in terms of our shared military history and our shared political history and legacies of civil rights and protest? Now, equally overlooked in American history are the Philippine chapters of names more familiar to us, as careers advanced in the Philippines led to Washington's corridors of power, whether for William Howard Taft or Dwight Eisenhower, Paul Wolfowitz, or Paul Manafort. What were they doing in the Philippines? And what were Filipinos doing next to them in the US Armed Forces? Bound by War begins with those questions. Answering them requires the history of soldiers and sailors who crossed the Pacific, of two nations bound together by the wars they fought there, and of the century that they built together. Now, the book overall has three main aims. First, it seeks to restore this history, to document that the United States maintained a colonial army for most of the 20th century, and recovering the remarkable military service history of Filipino soldiers and sailors. Second, it seeks to view American history from the Pacific, showing that we have always been a Pacific power, and that the Pacific century, announced over and over from 1900 until at least the beginning years of the 21st century, was not only a rhetorical strategy of US foreign policy, but in fact was a lived experience, that the Pacific century was a shared history of migration, work, culture, and family life. And third thing that the book aims to do is to encourage us to think in new ways about the US armed forces. To understand 20th century America, you have to understand the US military, not only as a destructive or fighting force, but a generative one that transformed social relationships, immigration patterns, ideas about race and culture. Now, the core aspects of this relationship were set in place in the years right after the US conquest in 1898, and they remain remarkably steady across the 20th and 21st centuries. And most books of history are histories of change. This is a book about continuity and ways in which this history has stayed fundamentally the same. Now, Filipinos' military service didn't stop when the United States granted independence to the country in 1946. The Philippines shifted from colony to ally as Japan shifted from enemy to friend. The Cold War soon burned hot in Korea and Vietnam. Here you see a Philippine contingent called PEFTOC that served in South Korea from 1950 to 1953. And war in Asia meant that even with independence, the two nations and their soldiers and sailors would continue to serve together. And just as they did not only in Korea, but also in Vietnam. You see a medic here on the right. Now, in 1947, a bilateral agreement granted the United States access to 23 military bases in the new nation, an agreement that also provided for the enlistment of up to 2,000 Filipinos directly in the US Navy every year from 1947 until 1992. And in the 1960s in particular, planes landed at Clark Air Base as ships arrived at Subic Bay Naval Station. But a generation later, this history was still in place. Operation Enduring Freedom, which we often call the war in Afghanistan, was in fact a global undertaking. And the largest undertaking outside of Afghanistan was in the southern Philippines. And in 2003, as the United States declared its war in Iraq, about 31,000 non-citizens wore the uniforms of the US Armed Forces. 20% of those were Filipinos, more than from any other country in the world. Now, through it all, from the 1890s until the 2020s, countless other Filipinos and Filipino Americans who never wore a uniform were nonetheless affected by the service of those who did, were bound by war and the wars those two nations fought together. All the people who worked for or near the US military, civilian farmers and factory workers like this man from California in the 1940s, who produced food, weapons, and airplanes, spouses who kept families together during sailors' long absences at sea, young protesters demanding equal treatment for aging veterans. Now, for most of the 20th century, service in the US Armed Forces offered the clearest path to migration and to US citizenship for those Filipinos who wanted it. An image you see here is says the future home of the Filipino community of Vallejo, California. And it's not hard to see the traces of this military legacy on the landscape, as some of the communities in the continental United States, the greatest number of Filipino Americans, also happen to be those that are US Navy towns. Vallejo, California, near Mare Island, National City, near the Naval Station San Diego, Norfolk and Virginia Beach, near Hampton Roads. In 2021, the United States counts some 4 million Filipino Americans, one of the nation's fastest growing ethnic groups, and many trace their family history to a father or an uncle in US military uniform. And when they don't, someone else's father or uncle casts a shadow. Military service, even for those without these genealogical and family connections, nevertheless provides Filipinos a language of patriotism and sacrifice, and therefore an avenue on demands for equality. Immigrants and their children used these words not only to wage a decades-long struggle for equity for World War II veterans, which I'll talk about this evening, but also to find a place for themselves in America, making their military service part of America's military history, making their protests and lawsuits part of its civil rights legacy, handing down memories and mindsets of war and the military from one generation to the next. Now, a broken promise stands at the heart of this history. And I want to focus in the second part of this talk on a very important law, the Rescission Act of 1946, a law that probably most people listening to this may never have heard of before. And what you see here in this image is not a picture of the Rescission Act. This is a picture of Manila in 1945, just to set the scene for what the Philippines looked like in the years immediately after the Second World War. I'm going to trace the history of how the Rescission Act was passed and why, and what it did. Just briefly, it retroactively stripped some 200,000 Filipino soldiers of their access to US naturalization rights and veterans benefits. But I'm also going to trace the ways that over the next 6 decades, Filipino Americans and their allies and advocates challenged the Rescission Act, challenged its exclusions, and called the United States to maintain the promises that it had made in the darkest days of the Second World War. So what I want to do is sort of look at both how these promises were made and also how they were broken. So first of all, as I mentioned, Filipinos served in many forms during the Second World War under the American flag. In July of 1941, an executive order by President Franklin Roosevelt called all of the military and naval forces in the Philippines into a unified force, USAFI, the U.S. Army Forces in the Far East. By doing so, sort of incorporated this into the U.S. armed forces. That Roosevelt's efforts were then amplified by the declarations of the Philippine president, Sergio Osmeña, who you see on the right, who declared that guerrillas were also eligible for inclusion into USAFI, and to battlefield commands issued at the time by General Douglas MacArthur, who famously claimed with the words equal pay for equal risk, and demanded that Filipino soldiers should receive pay and benefits equivalent to all the other soldiers under his command. So promises were very clearly made, and among them, after the war, soldiers often cited a 1942 amendment to the Nationality Act of 1940, which promised non-citizen soldiers access to naturalization as long as they filed their paperwork by December 31st, 1946. Now, during the war, around the world, over 140,000 immigrant soldiers from almost 100 countries somehow gained US citizenship through this path. And some of them, in fact, were Filipinos. The image you see here is from a military facility in New Jersey, and a small number of Filipino soldiers who are being naturalized as US citizens under the terms of the Nationality Act of 1940. So we know that the law applied to these soldiers, but we know that almost none of them were able to access it. So why is that the case, right? Why was the promise broken? And here I want to turn to the story of Attorney General Tom Clark. Now, on August 1st, 1945, the US government authorized the INS, the Immigration and Naturalization Service, to carry out the naturalizations that the 1940 Act permitted. But of course, this very quickly came under scrutiny. And historians and legal advocates have scrutinized the archives looking for sort of a paper trail on this. And no one found it in the 1940s, no one found it in the 1970s. I was not able to find it in my own research, but it seems clear that officials in both the US government and the Philippine colonial government agreed that mass naturalization of Filipino soldiers might lead to large-scale emigration of Filipinos to the United States, and that this was a result that neither the US government nor the Philippine colonial government actually wanted to see. As Attorney General Tom Clark put it, quote, "It would be a political embarrassment and a drain of manpower to have a mass exodus of the young Filipino ex-fighting men and women going to the United States on the eve of independence of the new nation. Remember, the Philippines is on track for independence on July 4th, 1946. And Attorney General Tom Clark and some other figures who left no paper trail of their decision clearly seem to have agreed that large-scale naturalization and migration was not a good idea. Soon came a solution worthy of Catch-22, a World War II novel from a different theater of the war. On September 13th, 1945, notice that date is just days after Japanese officials surrendered to the US aboard the USS Missouri. The US Commissioner of Immigration wrote to Attorney General Clark, asking that the naturalization situation be, quote, handled by revoking the authority granted, and, quote, omitting to designate any representative to confer citizenship in the Philippine Islands. So just to turn that into plain English, what that means is that the INS officer, the one person who had the authority to grant citizenship, would be removed from the Philippines and not replaced, right? And so for some 200,000 soldiers who had a legal right to claim US citizenship, had no one to ask for it. And that remained the case until August 1946, when the INS returned, and during a brief window between August and December of that year, a naturalization office did operate, but only in Manila, and served some 4,000 Filipinos out of nearly 200,000 who served. The US Justice Department's maneuvers thus foreclosed large-scale naturalizations and migrations, but also denied basic rights to Filipino soldiers who had marched next to American soldiers at Bataan and been imprisoned next to them. This was not America's finest hour. Next came a second broken promise. Now, this was not about citizenship, but about benefits. Filipino veterans were going to be expensive, with lifetime benefit costs of 200,000 veterans running possibly as high as $3.2 billion. So Senator Carl Hayden of Arizona, together with Senators Richard Russell of Georgia and Charles Brooks of Illinois, drafted what would become known as the Rescission Act, which included a provision which was inserted by the Senate Appropriations Committee following an off-the-record debate that said that wartime service in the organized military forces of the Philippines shall not be deemed to have been active military, naval, or air service for the purpose of any law conferring rights, privileges, or benefits. To turn that into plain English, Filipino soldiers were not American soldiers, at least when it came time to pay them their benefits. The law thus blocked individual claims by Filipino veterans from the Philippine Army and the guerrillas, men who had earned those rights on the battlefield under the terms of US law, US executive orders, and battlefield commands. No GI Bill, no college loan, no home mortgage, no medical care, no widow's stipend, not even a flag for the soldier's casket. This was not America's finest hour either. Now, President Harry Truman very much wanted to veto the bill, but he was mindful of the pressures of a belt-tightening post-war Congress. He knew that the Philippines would require military service and aid. He was aware of what he called the, quote, practical difficulties of making payments to veterans in the Philippines from the United States. And so on February 18th, 1946, about 75 years ago, he signed the Rescission Act. But he appended to it a signing statement, right, a kind of a dissent of sorts, in which he insisted that there, quote, existed a moral obligation of the United States to look after the welfare of our Philippine Army veterans. And he also assured, quote, our comrades in the Philippines that the issue is receiving attention and is being expedited as much as possible. And in doing so, President Truman became the first of literally a dozen presidents to promise Filipino veterans that they would receive action and redress, but at some later future date. For Filipino veterans, the Rescission Act was a broken promise, and it would remain unfinished business for decades to come. In fact, it would take about 63 years to undo the harms that the Rescission Act had caused, including protests such as these, a sit-in and hunger strike at MacArthur Park in Los Angeles in 1997. And in the second half of Bound by War, alongside the military history of Filipinos in Korea, Vietnam, and Iraq, I also traced the political history of Filipino American veterans and their advocates. A story that I think comprises a crucial chapter, a very important one, in America's civil rights heritage. And in part, what I like to say is that this is the story of how Filipino World War II veterans, not only how they were excluded, but how they made themselves included. They included themselves in what we now call the greatest generation. And if I wanted to explain how that happened, I would give you 5 steps in that process, and I want to trace those in the next few minutes. First was an upsurge of organized political efforts that emerged after the 1980s. And a crucial turning point here is the end of the Marcos regime in 1986. What you see here are massive protests in the main superhighway of Manila that led to the overthrow of the Marcos regime and its replacement with the presidency of Corazon Aquino. Now, what this did is it actually broke the ties between the Marcos and Filipino World War II veterans. The military veterans were a crucial constituency of his regime, and support for their claims on the United States was very much wrapped up with his own political agenda. And with the end of his administration, opens up new opportunities for this to become a nonpartisan issue upon which, in many ways, all Filipinos and Filipino Americans could come to agree. Second, another crucial turning point right around the same time is the end of the Cold War in 1989 and the closure of US military bases after 1991. That the military bases agreement came to a conclusion, was not renewed. But some of the bases closed through other means. What you see here is an image of Clark Air Base in the wake of the destruction of the explosion of the volcano Mount Pinatubo in 1991. But whether closed by Mother Nature or by bilateral agreement, what the end of the Cold War did was sort of bring to an end a vocabulary of bilateral relationship, Cold War allyship, and also a language in which Filipino veterans were forced to frame their claims as requests for foreign aid, and instead a turn from that to one of claiming individual rights and benefits. But in order for Filipino veterans to make those claims for rights in the United States, they needed not only a political vocabulary, but also political savvy, political allies, and a path to political power. And here, a third sort of key turning point is the emergence in the years after the 1960s of the Asian American movement. As individual sort of ethnic and immigrant groups from Asia consolidated around a shared Asian American identity and turned that into an oppositional political process. They were inspired by the civil rights movements of the 1960s. They were inspired by the ethnic revival of the 1970s, and it emerges in communities all across the country. But nowhere was it more important and more visible than in California, particularly in the Bay Area, where Filipino American workers joined the United Farm Workers grape strikes, where students participated in student strikes, for example, at San Francisco State College in 1968, or in the long battle between 1968 and 1981 to stop the destruction of San Francisco's International Hotel. That's the image you see here. A Chinatown rooming house that served low-income, aging city residents, Filipino and otherwise, that galvanized a citywide activist collective. Now, the emergence of an explicitly pan-ethnic Asian American movement brought visibility, allies, and new agendas, particularly after 1988, when victims of Japanese American incarceration and internment won a major victory with the passage of the Civil Liberties Act of 1988, winning not only a formal apology from the US government, but also monetary redress. And they won it not in the courts, but in the halls of Congress. And this provided an important sort of spark for legislative activism among Filipino veterans and their advocates. And along the way also requires mobilizing Asian American political power, not only on the streets, as we saw in the last slide, but also in the halls of Congress. And this follows in the wake of the Immigration Act of 1965, as Filipino populations in the United States grew and continued to grow, reaching almost 2 million by the late 1980s and some 4 million in 2021. And they increasingly found representative voices in Congress. Although Filipino Americans were and are underrepresented in the US House of Representatives, there were increasingly advocates and allies among Asian American constituents and constituencies and among congressional representatives. You see here two of the earliest Asian American members of Congress from Hawaii, Senator Daniel Inouye, himself a World War II veteran, and Patsy Mink from Congress. Now, many of these over the years began to build up a significant amount of seniority, as you can see in the shift from the previous slide to this one. And as they did so, they increasingly wielded more power in Washington. Representative Norman Mineta formed the Congressional Asian Pacific American Caucus in 1994. And also by the 1990s and 2000s, representatives who reflected large Asian American constituencies, people such as Representative Bob Filner of San Diego, begin to pay increasing attention to the concerns of Filipino voters, particularly as more of those migrants naturalized and registered to vote as US citizens. Now, a fifth shift along the way is also a cultural shift. Right, that in the 1980s and in the 1990s, American political culture both named the greatest generation and embraced it as the sine qua non for heroic American citizenship, paying closer attention to the wartime service of everyone in the World War II generation, but also new attention in the 90s and 2000s to the service of soldiers and sailors of color. Now, of course, there were Hollywood movies and best-selling books like the ones you see here, but what interested me was the legislation and the hearings that poured out of congressional veterans subcommittees on both sides of the House and the Senate. And these initiatives appeared to take on an urgency in the 1990s as it became clear that the population of World War II veterans had begun to shrink as they aged. And these new patterns, both in power and in culture, open space for veterans and their advocates to make their claims. And by the 1990s, the dismissal of the claims of Filipino veterans that were so common in the 40s and 50s no longer aligned with US political culture. And what we see are a series of turning points. First, in November 1990, the confluence of these forces led to a provision in the Immigration and Naturalization Act. The most recent of our sort of comprehensive immigration reforms was undertaken more than 30 years ago. This 1990 Act included a provision that granted most Filipino veterans a 2-year window of opportunity to naturalize as citizens. And in this moment, and you see an image from a ceremony in Los Angeles in 1991, supporters repeated General Douglas MacArthur's wartime insistence on, quote, equal pay for equal risk, and argued that American veterans should get access to citizenship. Now, of about 70,000 eligible veterans who were surviving in 1990, some 28,000 were naturalized by 1998, when the process came to an end. And of those, about 17,000 migrated to the United States, where many then in turn invoked the family reunification provisions of immigration law in order to sponsor the migration of relatives from the Philippines. Right, so this is taking on a life of its own, but it's also leaving much unanswered, right, including the question of benefits. Right, the 1990 Act addressed only citizenship, not benefits. And so the protests continued, like this one in San Francisco in the late 1990s. Now, throughout the 2000s, advocates on Capitol Hill repeatedly introduced legislation And interestingly enough, the VA began explicitly to endorse it, as did other veterans organizations like the American Legion and other groups. But time and again, the legislation stalled. There were long-standing assumptions about the foreignness of Filipino soldiers and fears about the costs of granting full equity. As late as 2008, North Carolina Senator Richard Burr objected to what he called, quote, aid for foreigners, and warned that equity legislation would take money away from our veterans in this country, even though Filipino World War II veterans were veterans of this country, and most of them were living in this country. But a big shift happened in January of 2009, which brought a new constellation of forces. First of all, it was the worst economic crisis since the Great Depression. It was also the 111th Congress, which placed Senator Daniel Inouye in the chair seat of the Senate Committee on Appropriations, handling all of the money. Senator Daniel Akaka in charge of the Senate Committee on Veterans Affairs, handling veterans legislation. And across the Capitol, San Diego's Representative Bob Filner as head of the House Committee on Veterans Affairs, who shared their interests. Together, along with many others supporting them, they succeeded in folding the longstanding legislation for Filipino veterans equity into the 2009 American Recovery and Reinvestment Act. Now, that law, the stimulus bill that followed the financial crisis of 2008 included many provisions, and you can be forgiven if you overlooked this one. But it included the authorization of up to $198 million for a Filipino Veterans Equity Fund, which would pay a one-time sum of $15,000 to eligible World War II veterans who were US citizens, and $9,000 to eligible World War II veterans who were Philippine citizens. Now, symbolically, but I think very importantly, the act also overturned the spirit, if not the letter, of the Rescission Act. It did announce that service in the wartime Philippines was, quote, active service for the purpose of administering VA and other federal benefits. So that passage that I showed you earlier has not been officially repealed. It remains on the books. But the provisions of the Filipino Veterans Equity Fund legislation did effectively undermine it. But there was also a quid pro quo, which said that all of this needs to be done by September 17th, 2009, a sort of brief, 9-month window that sort of permitted all of these claims to be made, and that after that point, all claims would be considered closed. Now, in public, veterans and their advocates celebrated, but behind closed doors, the conversation was harder, sometimes even bitter. They knew that this victory was imperfect, and they knew that it was too little, too late. It would serve all too few of the soldiers and sailors who had liberated and defended the Philippines between 1941 and 1945. Now, congressional researchers estimated that the eligible population of surviving veterans in 2009 stood at somewhere between 15 and 18,000 people out of some 200,000 who served. The passage of time, along with the challenge of documenting guerrilla service nearly 7 decades after war in the jungle, meant that the VA recognized and released payments for only a fraction of these, some 12,000 of the surviving World War II veterans. Now, the achievement of these lump sum payments in the Recovery Act of 2009 came with flourishes of nostalgia and back-patting patriotism. Representative Michael Honda, the chair of the Congressional Asian Pacific American Caucus, boasted that, quote, after a decades-long struggle, the Filipino World War II veterans have finally received the recognition and compensation they deserve for their brave service to the US during World War II. Now, phrases like that have all the markings of a happy ending, but I don't want to leave you at the end of my talk tonight with a sense of a happy ending. Instead, I'd rather end with a line from Lillian Galedo, a co-chair of the National Alliance for Filipino Veterans Equity, who was, I think, more right than Representative Honda when she described the stimulus as, quote, yet another beginning. Now, the Filipino World War II veterans will soon fade into history. Their last claim on the state will pass, but the political struggles that they embodied and the enduring bonds that they forged between the United States and the Philippines are sure to continue for another century to come. Thank you.
So we have a number of questions that have been coming in from the audience, and we can get started with those. Just to get us started, can you tell us a little bit about your research process? How did you search out these stories, and what were the archives that were really key to your work?
Thanks for that question, and I think it's important for people who work mostly in U.S. history, or sort of to realize that this history is not just waiting to be told or waiting to be found in one archive. And among other things, I discovered basically the minute that you walk into the door of the archives, you start to understand the colonial relationship and the inequalities that exist in it. It is a simple fact that the history of the Philippines before 1946 is better recorded and preserved in the United States than it is in the Philippines. That's the inequality of colonialism. It's also the destruction of the Second World War. So putting this story together was in fact part of the biggest part of the process, right? It required me not only to go to do research in official archives in the United States and the Philippines, but also to track down new ones, right? To find local and community histories that were there. And also, a shout out here to Mass Historical and all the other state historical societies that have kept the stories of immigrant communities, as well as the stories of soldiers who served in the Philippines, whether in the 1890s or the 1940s. To sort of record and assemble all of that was part of what I was doing. And also a special thanks to the Filipino American National Historical Society, FONS, which is a kind of community-based organization that since the 1970s, under the leadership of Dorothy Cordova and the late Fred Cordova, have recorded oral histories and other sort of documents that thankfully they interviewed people in the 1970s who I would not have had a chance to meet.
Great. Well, Scott wrote, great discussion. As part of the Rescission Act debate, were there any modified or relative benefits that were contemplated? More specifically, given the significant differences in cost of living between the US and the Philippines, was there any contemplation of providing benefits that would have been adjusted to the cost of living for Filipinos who would have a lower cost of living, presumably?
No, that's a great question. And along the way, the United States did actually provide sort of partial benefits of various kinds. So, I gave the long list of all the things that the Rescission Act took away. Some of them were slowly restored, including hospital and medical care, particularly for service-connected disabilities, right? Soldiers who had been injured in the Second World War. And often benefits were paid at unequal rates, often as sort of a 2-to-1 sort of ratio where veterans who were living in the Philippines might actually receive half as much as they would in the United States. This was rationalized as a reflection of the different cost of living. To many Filipinos, it was, it felt like a second-class status for sure. Some of the ironies, of course, are that because there are some Filipinos who were able to access full US veterans benefits, particularly if they served in the US Navy, for example, after 1946, who then might retire to the Philippines and earn a full US veterans sort of pension or other sort of benefits, and would actually do quite well. There was a phase during sort of the currency deflations of the 1980s when veterans were some of the sort of best paid people in the country. But they were far outnumbered by those who were fully excluded from this.
So Susan wrote, she said, Chris, one of your self-described goals was a quote, recovery project to tell an unknown story of injustice. I am curious how your work has aligned and if it has ever conflicted in any way, large or small, large or small, with the work of Filipino American advocates and activists who have also fought to tell the story and earn recognition?
Um, that's also a great question. I think so. I've been fortunate actually to work in the last 6 or 7 years with a group called the Filipino Veterans Recognition and Education Project, and Sarah shared some of the links to that in the chat, which has advocated, among other things, for the full repeal of the Rescission Act and for the awarding of the Congressional Gold Medal to veterans in the Philippines, both Filipino and American, during the Second World War. And for the most part, this has been a great opportunity, and a history that is sort of buried in the archives is, one that can't fully be told, sort of by one group or another. Veterans have their version, immigrants might have another, someone from the Philippines might have another, and I'm hoping to kind of bring these histories together. So in that sense, that has been good. And if there have been tensions, it has been, for example, that, just to give one example, the digital exhibition that I shared in the chat is called sort of under one flag. And it sort of tells the story of how these two groups are really fighting for one country. But in many ways, they are also fighting for two countries, right? And sort of saying it's complicated can be hard for activists to work with. But I think because so little of this history has been fully and widely told with a full archive, I feel like that's my role and my contribution in this process.
Great.
I let other people take it where they want to take
it. So we also have a question. If you've ever investigated how this experience compares to other imperial powers and the process of decolonization, and whether or not they have also failed to fulfill their promises, or how comparatively they have failed to maintain their promises with the populations who served in their military.
No, that's a great question, and that could be the next volume of this book, right? And I think part of the reason I like that question is that it situates the United States in dialogue with other empires, right? That it is situating the history of Filipinos in the U.S. Armed Forces is important to situate next to other people of color in the U.S. Armed Forces, but it's also important to put in the context of other empires. Right, and here the United States looks a lot like other empires, particularly European ones, but also the Japanese Empire and others, who have all sort of, it's very common to the imperial form to recruit service personnel from the places you're governing. What's most interesting to me are those countries that understand themselves to be republics, places like France or the Netherlands, who also have maintained empires and also maintained colonial military forces, and where questions of citizenship become very complicated. And so, of course, Britain has its own history of its relationship with particularly South Asian soldiers who served. But to me, the most interesting comparison is in France with a group of soldiers called les Harkis, who were Algerians who fought for the French in the Algerian War, and who found it very difficult to migrate to France. And when they did so, were very much sort of forgotten and overlooked and denied sort of equitable benefits. And their cause has also been taken up by a second generation of Algerian French citizens. And so I think that story is a kind of crucial sort of component that can be seen in other empires as well.
Great. Well, there's actually a couple different people who asked variations on the question of what drew you to this project, or what attracted you to this study.
I always say that the study found me in a lot of ways. That I had always had an interest in the history of the United States military as a social and a political force, and also an aim of breaking down some of the barriers in the historical profession, which I think are really false barriers between military history and social or political or cultural history. And I don't think that that's helpful for the profession. It's not helpful for general readers, right, who like military history or dislike it. Then I think understanding modern America requires getting to know this institution. It just so happened that when I was, thinking about ideas for this book, I came across the story of the Philippine Scouts and felt like that history needed to be told. It was in the 2000s when I was watching the final phase of the veterans benefits coming together, and frankly, it was also the war in Iraq, which was mobilizing sort of non-citizen laborers, mostly as contractors, many of them from the Philippines, as part of the U.S. military effort. And I really felt like that was a story that had a long history that could be excavated.
Great. Christopher asked a question. He said, as a historian who knows the earlier part of this history better than the latter, a comment I often make offhandedly when thinking about the annexation of the Philippines in 1898 is that virtually no one in the US advocating for annexation expected it would take until 1946 for the Philippines to gain independence. Do you buy that? How much do you think the unforeseen consequences and poor parentheses, racist planning from the outset of US insular status impacted the overall history you chronicle?
I would say, I don't know if I do buy that, actually. Well, this is where if we were in person, it would be more fun. We could have a real disagreement. I would say it's often presented that the United States annexed the Philippines in, almost by accident, right, or by, or inadvertently. And certainly, there were the short-term concerns about the war and about sort of imperial rivalry with Britain and Japan certainly outweighed the long-term understanding. This was not necessarily part of a grand strategy, as foreign policy thinkers would later come to understand. But I would say that most of the people who were in charge of annexation and occupation in the earlier years, among those Governor William Howard Taft, who you saw sitting on that poor Carabao in that slide in the presentation. William Howard Taft certainly imagined that the Philippines might be a permanent part, or that colonialism would be a permanent feature of the United States in the 20th century. That said, in the first half of the book, I trace sort of the long effort that Filipinos make for national independence, which took longer than anyone expected, and certainly than many people wanted, and was very much wrapped up not only in the military situation of the Philippines itself. Will this country be independent if it doesn't have an army, or if all of its best soldiers are in America's army? But also the global and geostrategic issues, particularly as Japan becomes an increasingly aggressive threat in the 1930s.
Great. So there was a question from a person whose name is listed as Miss Moonlight that says, thanks for the wonderful presentation and the research in the first place. Could you talk more about the discourses surrounding naturalization in relation to struggles of World War II African Americans for civil rights?
Yeah, it's a good question, because in some ways this is a chapter of the military history, the ways in which military service is mobilized for citizenship and benefits. For African Americans are, by law and status, citizens of the United States, but in terms of belonging and of access to rights, face some of the same exclusions and denials that Filipino veterans did. For most of the sort of 50s, 60s, 70s, those struggles happen quite separately. in part because most Filipino veterans in those years are still advocating for themselves from the Philippines, right? And doing so in a language of Cold War alliance and foreign aid. Whereas African Americans are sort of, especially African American military veterans of World War II, many of them are core actors in the 1950s civil rights movements in particular. So they're happening on separate tracks for a long time. But by the time you get to the 1980s and 90s, part of what I was trying to sort of trace out is how the military service of the World War II generation becomes so important to Americans of all backgrounds, that the military service of soldiers of color, whether it is Navajo code talkers or Tuskegee airmen, or Asian Americans from the 442nd, Japanese Americans, who, all of those stories become really powerful ways for an increasingly multi-ethnic 1990s and 2000s society to make claims on equality and belonging. I will also say there were some African Americans who criticized the Rescission Act in 1946. Not many. The Rescission Act didn't get a lot of press attention, but it did get picked up in the African American press and was criticized as unfair at the time. And not very many other people made that argument in 1946.
Somewhat of a follow-up question comes that says, do you document anti-Asian violence/conflict within armed services from the white GIs towards their Filipino comrades in arms? There was, of course, an epidemic of racist violence against Black GIs by whites, civilian and military servicemen. Are there parallels here?
Yes, there are. There are parallels, and the violence could take many forms. There are structural inequalities that come with sort of very racialized sort of form of service and the segregation that occurred within the forces, and the kinds of tasks that Filipino soldiers would be asked to do, which might put them in danger or in other sort of formats. There is tension and inequality and sort of dissent within the ranks. Sort of one sort of difficult history that I trace is that during the Bataan Death March, for example, really difficult sort of moment in American military history, you see instances of great solidarity between Filipino and American soldiers, but you also see tension and violence, right? That as they are really struggling for survival, the sort of racial differences and barriers bring out violence from white soldiers on the death march against Filipinos. Some of the places I also find this as well is in the Vietnam War, when Asian American soldiers, usually Filipino American soldiers who are serving in the U.S. Army or Navy or Air Force during the war, are sort of put in a very difficult position because white soldiers and sailors and airmen might be sort of seeing the Vietnamese as an enemy in a racialized way. And it was very easy for that violence and that racism to sort of jump to their Asian American service colleagues. So we definitely see it in the Vietnam period as well.
So I think we probably have time for one last question. And Cameron wrote, thanks so much for the talk. I'm curious if during your research you noticed any measurable impact of the Vietnam War, specifically its heightened focus on questions of veterans' rights, in either drawing focus to or away from Filipino veterans' demands for recognition and compensation.
Yes, I did notice it, but not during the Vietnam War itself, right? And I think that a crucial sort of aspect of that cultural shift that I sort of traced for the 1990s is that in the 1990s, the United States, and maybe 1980s and 90s, you start to see the emergence of stories of forgotten veterans, right? Who had been kind of left behind, overlooked. And the forgotten veteran in mass media was often a Vietnam vet, right? Often struggling with, and of course, that was not the experience of all Vietnam vets, but there were forgotten Vietnam vets who really struggled. And in the generation after the Vietnam War, as some of the kind of tensions over that participation sort of faded to kind of reflect like what was unfinished work in sort of addressing the needs of Vietnam vets, those forgotten veterans opened up a space for Filipino World War II veterans who were often struggling with some of the same things, poverty or joblessness, other kinds of issues, could kind of get their claims recognized. And so the fact that it became sort of so bad politics across the political spectrum to oppose veterans' benefits and issues was in many ways a post-Vietnam creation that World War II veterans tapped into.
Great. Well, thank you very much for a great presentation. And there were far more questions than we could possibly get to. So we will, everyone can know that we will pass on all the questions to you and you can answer them or not. But we'll pass them along. So I want to thank everyone for joining us. Consider buying a copy of Bound by War. We are always in favor of supporting locally owned businesses. So if you can make it to a locally owned bookstore, please do. If not, bookshop.org supports locally owned stores. So that's a good alternative if you'd like to just buy it online. So Professor Capozzola, thank you very much for your time. And thank you to the audience for joining us.